My name is Jason S.C. Fung, the host of Vanilla Club Podcast. Today's very special episode is with Forrest Rain Oliveros. Forrest is an American-born ballet dancer currently based in Hong Kong. Forrest entered the world of ballet through scholarships at Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater and the Ellison Ballet, two major dance schools in New York City. He has since performed with renowned ballet companies such as Hong Kong Ballet. And beyond the stage, Forrest also works as a dance teacher, choreographer, a model, and a DJ. Shout out to DJ Rain. We were fortunate to host Forrest on site at Vanilla Club in Coorumba, Queensland, an experience that unintentionally served as a blueprint for future Vanilla Club retreats. It was a week filled with great music, exceptional organic food, and plenty of authentic connections. In the podcast, we covered some really juicy topics with Forrest, including what it means to balance masculinity and femininity as a dancer. And we talked a lot about health perspectives from East and West and what it's like to be an American living in Hong Kong. We hope you enjoy. Welcome, Forrest Rain Oliveros.
Hi.
It's been so excellent to have spent this time with you at Kaswari Coorumba, also known as the Broken Nose Vanilla Plantation. Thank you for being here.
It's been so good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let's just follow up a little bit on what we were talking about in terms of the idea of power and athleticism combined with elegance and finesse. As a ballet dancer, as a professional, how do you see those two things interplay with each other?
Ballet demands a very high level intensity of physicality, of cardiovascular exercise, of anaerobic exercise, but simultaneously there's also a need to portray things as being effortless and easy. And a lot of the work that we do and the repertoire in a company is using the body and your physicality to tell a story. And so as much time and attention is put on refining our bodies to push the maximum limitations of physicality, there is also an equally important role of humanity and nature and storytelling. So as difficult as some particular jumps, turns, or lifts might be, we never want the audience to feel our struggle. The goal is to have the audience be able to relax and just enjoy without having to be aware in the present moment of all the difficulty and work that goes in behind the scenes.
So in a way, in order to achieve that level of seamlessness from the viewer's point of view, the professional on the stage almost has to suffer even more.
The goal is what seems to be so simple and easy isn't always as simple as the final product may be presented to be. And I think that there is an element of the theater, particularly with classical ballets, where we are taking an audience on a journey and allowing them to remove themselves from their modern day reality and stresses of everyday life. So while there's an element of entertainment, there's also kind of like a transportation to another world or another way of thinking, other mannerisms and characteristic qualities and communications that might not be seen in everyday modern life. So there is definitely a goal that we have to have a moment of fantasy for people who are living in modern day society.
And fantasy is a really interesting word, right? And it's so interesting how there is, when I think of ballet, I think of a lot of these juxtapositions, a lot of these paradoxes in terms of how much emphasis there is on making things seem effortless, right? From a child's point of view, to look at what's being performed and to almost see it as easy and simple and carefree. Whereas in reality, as an adult layperson, fan of ballet, but somebody who has no technical training, I can see there's way more to it than meets the eye.
How can we take something that's so far removed from everyday life? The ballet was really made for the royals, and King Louis XIII was for nobles and people that came from the most affluent and politically involved families of society, which is such a minority. And how do you take something that was based in exclusivity, and even the dancers themselves, there's such a few percentage of people that can really excel in this art form, and there's so few body types that fit in the necessary aesthetic for what we're trying to achieve. How do you make something that in its roots is exclusive, but make people feel like they are still a part of it and are able to relate to it without it seeming super disconnected? And a lot of ballet companies all over the world, there's really been an evolution of seeing ballet as a tool that can be used to communicate and translate so many different emotions, and bringing ballet more towards the general public. And I think in one way that's done with assimilating more modern day stories while using the purity of the classical technique and the traditional elements of mannerisms and posture and very clear masculine and feminine gender roles and love and things that people can relate to, while not making it seem so far removed from what they're able to grasp easily.
Definitely. And ballet could be an interesting lens within which to think about masculinity, because there's so many different dynamics. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so most of the stories in classical ballet are very stereotypical heterosexual relationships. There's always a male principal and a female principal that are the lead characters in almost every single one of the stories. And a lot of it has to do with either falling in love or falling out of love or revenge or affairs, death and rebirth. And most of the time, the males are either the hero or the savior in some way, and the woman is always a very iconic, feminine, soft, needs to be saved, almost Disney movie storyline like themes. So I'm not entirely sure why male ballet dancers have a stigma of being feminine or even maybe homosexual. Maybe because the industry is so female dominated. There's so many women in it, and when you think of ballet, you think of women. And in a lot of areas that is true, because the history of ballet was very female focused. And I think there were some real heavy hitters in the late 80s and early 90s that started making the male character in ballet companies and in ballets more of the spotlight and more of the star. You started seeing Brishnikov or Nureyev were really like pioneers of these male figures, because they were adding in a new layer of athleticism in their solos and their leaps and jumps and their turns, whereas before the male was always kind of a supporting role and the star was the female. Another thing that people sometimes might have a misconception about is that masculinity and femininity do not necessarily have direct ties to sexuality. And so I personally don't believe that gender roles per se have as much fluidity as the idea of masculine and feminine. I think there are men and women, but I think in those categories, there is a spectrum in which men can still be incredibly masculine in a heterosexual relationship and still have an incredible amount of feminine qualities. And so in ballet, there's a lot of exposure of the bodies and a deep level of comfort in men to be able to present themselves in such a way of really having their body exposed. And maybe because there is also an artistic and a creative element in the art form, that it might draw certain types of men in that wouldn't be drawn to even being interested in it to start with.
It's really interesting because you got into ballet, relatively speaking, a little bit late, right? I think you were saying that it was about 12 years old that you fully dove in. So 12 years old, you were developing physically, moving into your teenage years. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in those early days as you were learning the craft, and how might it have been different for you to jump in at a later stage as opposed to some of the ballerinas and ballerinos who basically take the plunge, as young as 5 or 6?
Well, I think the environment in which you're in heavily dictates how people are going to perceive you. And so if you are in maybe a more affluent family, a more affluent community, you're coming from more wealth, you're coming from more culturally and artistically educated people, there are less stigmas around stereotyping you as a male. And when I got into ballet, I lived in a very predominantly African-American neighborhood, very hip-hop culture, very low income. And so the knowledge of arts and the ballet was very, very low. And I think the less information you have about something, the less you're going to be able to grasp and understand it. So one of the benefits that I had going for me when I started ballet was that I was equally interested in urban and street styles of dance. So I was doing ballet, but I also had a very hip-hop persona. I knew how to freestyle. I did a little bit of b-boy, a little bit of popping and locking. And so people knew I was a dancer, but they didn't just associate me as being a ballet dancer. They just associated me as being a dancer. And because hip-hop culture is much more tied into the mainstream, that allowed me to be accepted by my peers and my high school and my community, because it was just more commonplace to see a hip-hop dancer as a male. And there was a few years in the beginning when I started that I definitely, ballet was more on the low key as far as what I presented myself as. And hip hop was more of what I pushed forward as like, oh, I'm a hip hop dancer that's doing ballet to kind of help my foundational elements. And I think the next step is also, because there are so many women in ballet, there's some men that might think it's kind of cool that you get to be around all these girls, you get to touch, girls and partnering, and like, what's it like to have all these friends that are women? And so I definitely also leaned into that, is like, oh, I have all of these really close female friends. And I think there's a lot of awkwardness in the adolescent stage of young boys because of varying degrees of maturity levels between girls and guys. And so you take a 13-year-old girl, maybe she's a little bit more comfortable and confident with herself, and the boy is like, doesn't really know how to flirt or how to show attraction or interest. And so he's kind of like maybe mean to her or pushy. Whereas because I was so assimilated into a group of mostly women and young girls, I became very comfortable and confident in a way around women. And that also was able to bring me some status in my male circle.
That's really interesting. So it was in a way intentional to present yourself as hip hop first, ballet potentially second.
Yeah. And then as I got more professional and more advanced in my training, I moved from my home city of Chattanooga, Tennessee to Charlotte, North Carolina, and I joined a school which was a pre-professional training program. So I dropped out of high school when I was 16, and I went to basically a dance academy. And so again, how the environment really dictates how you see yourself and how other people see you. So I was no longer at a public school. My social circle was majority dancers. And so I honestly, bullying or feeling insecure or kind of having this, I'm not really sure how, people will perceive me. I didn't struggle with that so much because I think it was like, I really pushed the hip hop thing when I was like younger, and I was in that like minority community, low income community. And then once I moved and got older and was around other dancers, obviously other dancers aren't going to be very judgmental towards me. And also, anything in life, when you first start, you don't necessarily have a cheerleading squad of people around you that are rooting for you. And I think as my talents and abilities were recognized, I was, on scholarships, I was offered apprenticeships, and the success allowed more just basic recognition in any environment, no matter what you're doing. Like you're good at something, you have a niche at something. And so I think with success comes respect from people who are, not haters. If you're successful at something, most people can recognize like, oh, there's a lot of passion in this that I can see him in. And I support that, good for you. Like go for it. And your earlier question about, you started with masculine and femininity. I will say I was not bullied, but definitely from a very early age, I was told by a lot of people that they either knew or they thought that I was gay. So that was super early on, like, you have very feminine mannerisms, or you appear to be gay, or you're just in the closet, or, you don't know yet, or you should accept yourself for who you are. And I think there's a variety of factors from that, maybe coming from not having basically any men in my family. I didn't grow up with a father. I didn't really grow up with a lot of male role models in my family. And then also being in an environment where definitely in the early stages of ballet, it's always going to be more women. You'll get a more even number of male-female ratios once you reach the professional level or the pre-professional level at like big international or national schools. The men and women's classes are always separated. So you pretty much always are going to train with boys all day at most of the big schools, and all the girls are going to train with girls unless you're doing partnering classes. So in that environment, once you start reaching a higher level, you're not going to feel weird because like your class is like 15 guys or 10 guys. But in the beginning, before I really had that like male camaraderie in ballet, a lot of people really did push that on me. And I think this is where there's a real flaw, that people are equating feminine and masculine elements with sexual preference. And those two things, I think, you really can separate them into two completely different categories. I think you can have a very expressive young male who likes to maybe I really like to wear lots of colors, and my mom was very like funky and eccentric. She owned a clothing store that had like costumes and like a boutique shop. So I had access to a lot of, like cool clothing, and my mom really encouraged me to like dress how I wanted to. And so there were many elements that people identify as homosexual that kind of are more, maybe just more expressive. Homosexual men, like they dance at parties more. They're like not as insecure. They're not nervous around women. They talk to girls super free, and they let their hair go, and just are just very expressive, and sometimes loud, have loud personalities. And I had a lot of those qualities, but it didn't have anything to do with my sexual preferences. It was just kind of like who I was.
That's really interesting. And again, going back to your earlier comments about, these archetypes inside of ballet, where you really have male characters that are unambiguously masculine, and then feminine characters that are unambiguously damsel in distress, princesses, soft and requiring some type of rescue from a male character, right? Because again, these themes come from a 19th century, potentially earlier,
courts.
Right? Royal courts developed over centuries, and in those times, the definition of male and the definition of female was much more fixed than it is today, perhaps. So, what do you think about when you hear the phrase toxic masculinity? Right? It's a phrase that we hear today, and we can maybe pin down a definition of what that is. But I just wanted to get your take off the cuff as to what do you think toxic masculinity might be defined as?
Maybe I'll start with like what causes men to operate in such characteristics that women or society would deem to put them in those categories. I think there's a lot of men specifically in today's culture where there's a really big movement of LGBTQ, and the pride movement is very big in the West, that you have a lot of men that, if that's not how you identify, if you have any of those qualities that are associated with those groups, it's very easy to be like I was, kind of like lumped up, or like you're not accepting yourself, or you're in the closet, or you're lying to yourself. And so to compensate that, a lot of men lean to the other end of the extreme of aggression and dominance and this hyper masculinity, like rough and tumble, or like getting super drunk, or being very forward with women, kind of objectifying women and treating them like as objects or viewing them as objects. And it can kind of spiral down, because I think from my experience, my balanced femininity that has been very interwoven with my character and personality has enabled me to become close and earn trust with a vast higher percentage of women than the average man who may have not fully had his feminine elements accepted in himself or had them developed. And so there is a reason why a lot of women have like a gay best male friend, and why is it that she trusts him? And it's because I think a lot of women would love to be friends with men, would love to have male friends, but the reason they maybe take their gay best friend out with them instead of their male best friend is that they don't feel that they can trust the straight guy. They don't feel like he can keep his lust and hypersexuality under control. So women don't often want to worry about whether or not you're trying to sleep with them. And a lot of men don't read social cues well, or there's this kind of dichotomy about like, are you playing hard to get? Like, are you saying no? So I need to kind of like keep pushing this more. And when you're with the gay man, you don't have to worry about, I can I'm super drunk and I want to, go back to your house and crash on your couch. And he's like, yeah, whatever. Like you can change in front of me. And, it's just this real relaxation and comfort. But at the same time, it is still a man. And so there is this feeling of safety or protection that in social situations, and I've seen this many times, that girls in girl groups, if you have one male in the group, it can really deflect a lot of unnecessary or unwanted male attention. And so it's like for women, you either have your all girls group or you're like on a date with a man. And a lot of times when men see women with another man, it might deter them a bit. So maybe I'm getting sidetracked off your question, but I think that the toxic masculinity is really just coming from a lot of insecurities and not having fully actualized maybe who they are, and understanding that for themselves, whatever that may be, but just really being comfortable in your own skin, expressing yourself as you want to express yourself, and not being worried about like, oh, I'm going to get lumped up with this type of group. And I think I really take that to the extreme. Like when I go out, I like looking sexy. Like I could even use that adjective, like I'm a handsome man, but there's been many times where I've had like a sheer top and like bell bottom pants. But I think you can circle this back into environment. If you look at the rock stars in America in the 1980s, the straight ones, they look super gay. Like eyeliner, long hair, jewelry, makeup, or even in modern day, if you go to Korea, the environment there, the culture and the women really love beautiful men. They really love pretty men. And it's very normal to wear makeup or to wear a foundation or to just be very well groomed and very just pretty. Like, they have, a lot of the Korean men have almost a feminine essence or energy about them. And so I think it really depends on where you are. And I was born in the country in Southeast United States. So that culture is very boots and blue jeans and big pickup trucks and guns. And so the men, most of them have really heavy facial hair. And those are kind of maybe your more stereotypical like manly men, masculine manly men. But it really just depends on what environment you're in. And so I think it's hard to make a blanket statement, because you could move from Tennessee to New York City to Korea as the exact same version of yourself, and those different environments could perceive you all completely differently.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's so much to unpack here, because going to your point about how masculinity is defined differently based on geography and culture, I think that there's a really interesting perspective that you bring to this. And when we talk about toxic masculinity, it's a tricky phrase. And is it just hyper masculinity that we're talking about? Because I think it's a very tricky phrase once you apply something as incendiary as the word toxic. But I think the way that you framed it, where you have sort of masculinity, and then you frame it in terms of a spectrum, right? Where there's almost this overcompensating hyper masculinity. To me, that fits a little bit better. I can understand it a little bit better.
There's one comment that just came to mind that I think people talk a lot about toxic masculinity and toxic femininity, and then we're discussing right now how to identify that. I think it actually doesn't even matter, feminine or masculine. I think the traits that are toxic are just universal. A toxic trait to a man is exactly parallel to a toxic trait to a woman. Any quality that is toxic regardless of gender. And I think when you try to split it up into two categories or two groups, you almost weaponize it against the other gender, instead of just saying like, what is just common decency and common human nature? Like, what is it about people that regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, that is a toxic trait? Because anything that would be toxic in a man, if you separated it from the fact that it's a man, that means that that's a negative, that's a non-good trait. And so I think it should almost be more, it should just be like, these are just bad human traits. Like, it doesn't matter if you're a woman and you're promiscuous, or you're a man and you're promiscuous, or if you're, I don't know, very overbearing or hyper controlling or dominant or aggressive in an unnecessary or just not a good way. That would just be considered a bad trait.
Absolutely. Because I think the masculinity topic, really is relevant right now, because I think there are a lot of young men who are struggling in a way to find some type of
Identity.
ideological fit,
Mm.
identity,
Mm.
right? And for a young man coming up today, if you hear phrases like toxic masculinity, right? And again, I think that was a great answer that you just gave about these are ultimately the traits, but young men today have to deal with these labels.
Mm.
They have to deal with things that people place on them, for example. And something as broad and sweeping as toxic masculinity, I think leaves a lot of young men a little bit lost, a little bit struggling to understand, okay, if I watch, as you said, some of the classical ballets, right? Don Quixote, for example, right? There is an archetypal masculine male role, right? That is in there. There's a sword fight. He's rescuing. He's doing this. He's just kicking ass. And he's being this archetypal man in the context of some type of dramatic story. And that's easy to understand. But today, we don't really seem to celebrate those type of defined roles, right? And that we have there's a lot of minefields out there for young men. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit of your perspective as to somebody in your generation, where we know there's more and more awareness of mental health. You know, for young men out there, what do you see as some of the issues, for example, that young men might be confronting?
Well, I think the root of the issue deeply is fatherless households. And so I think society is made up of the nuclear family. So I think that's, you take every single family and that makes a community, that makes a society, that makes a nation. And when you don't have the example of a father, and you don't watch your father treating your mother with respect and kindness and gentleness while still being a strong, firm rock and a provider and a leader and still having assertiveness and strength, that kind of balance of being gentle with the woman who is a weaker, softer species naturally, just from a completely evolutionary physical standpoint. The women are more vulnerable. There is a need to protect. You don't see that example being set. Where then do you look for? Everyone needs a goal. Everyone needs a model to be able to aim forward, to have a clear picture of, okay, that's what I see as my ideal, and that I want to figure out how to take the steps to get there. And so there will always be something in front of you that you're idolizing or you're modeling yourself after. There's never a void. You can't just have nothing. And so if there's a fatherless household, then what is it that is taking the place of the father in millions and millions of families all over the world? What is it? Is it media? Is it Instagram? Is it TV shows that glorify men being, well, here maybe as a side note. So it seems like, as in society, if you have a man who has 10 girls, and in the music videos and in the rap videos, and it's very seen as like Casanova, and he's the man, so it just looks like that's a model I can model myself after. Like, I want to be that guy who has all of the women. But on the flip side of that, if you have a woman who has tons of men, society almost never really deems her as being a model. It's kind of like even the words to describe a promiscuous man and a promiscuous woman have very different connotations, where one is almost like kind of rebellious cool, and the other one is very degrading and sleazy. And I do think that is because women, one of the biggest gifts that women have always had from a historical perspective is purity and innocence. And their sexuality is something that is very sacred. Whereas with maybe for men, it is harder to have lots of girls. And so because of it being more difficult, that makes it more rare. So that creates more value. Whereas women, it might be very easy for even your average woman to have lots of men if she wanted to be promiscuous. And so that's kind of looked down upon. And it's hard to say which comes first, but I think if women are not operating in a healthy feminine and their element of holding themselves to a very high standard and using their purity as the gold at the end of the rainbow, that's kind of always what it's been, is like, you have this young virgin girl and like she's so pure and there's a sacredness about it. But to have her, you need to slay the dragon. You need to go fight wars and cross battles and like earn her and ask for her father's hand in marriage. And her father says, no, you have no money. You need to go out and you need to like make something of yourself before you earn my daughter. And then you can have her as a reward for your hard work. And so women, I think in this generation, have tried to take this power. Like if men can be like this and be deemed as not being judged, then we can be like this too. We're promiscuous and like we can sleep around and we're not being used because we're going to use you. So we're no longer the victim anymore because we've taken power back into our own hands. And I think when birth control was introduced, it really changed the game in the culture because it gave women so much power and took away the risk of childbearing, which was always kind of a big factor when it came to sleeping with people. Is like you sleep with someone and then you have a kid. That's the way it was for the majority of human history. But then birth control came into the picture, and I think that gave women the upper hand of taking their sexuality or sexual identity like back into their own hands. And so it's hard to say, is it men that need to be, it's actually not hard to say. I do believe that as a man, having the innate responsibility of being the leader and the protector need to protect women's hearts and spirituality and their sexuality. But at the same time, if you have a big movement in culture where women are taking pride in their promiscuity, you have rappers now like Nicki Minaj and Megan Thee Stallion, and the lyrics, you didn't used to have female rappers like that. Before it was just the male rappers talking about all the girls. Now you have female rappers talking about doing what the male rappers did to the women. So it's not that one is worse than the other, but I think for a long time, women felt very oppressed and suppressed. And as maybe from an evolutionary perspective, being a more softer, weaker of the two sexes in some ways, it was more easy for men to dominate women, that women are kind of like, no, I'll dominate you. Like I'm the boss now. And so that rise in the masculine energy in young women today has pushed men into their feminine energy in a negative way. So you have women who are hyper masculine, and I think that even ties into women. Again, this is not a bad thing that women are making their own money. Women are killing it in the education system. When it comes to universities, like women are, in many, many studies across the board, are wiping guys off the table. And I think because one of the reasons is they mature faster, they just do better in classroom settings, they're less rambunctious, they're less talkative. So in the academic setting, women are killing the game. They're making more money, they can provide for themselves. They don't see like needing a man. And it's, I think, pushing men into an area that they feel like, well, if you're if you're the leader and you're the boss and you're so strong and assertive and dominant, then like, what's my role? Like, where do you need me from? And I think there has to be a healthy balance. And so I think it really goes extreme on both ends. I think a lot of the men are turning hyper feminine and they're kind of submissive and they don't really want to they don't want to make the girl mad and kind of how just tiptoeing around and like more timid. And you have these women who are like, I'm the boss. They're kind of taking that like stereotypical male role or like I can provide for myself, like I can pay for my own dinner, like I don't need you, I don't want to be in the kitchen, I don't want to be raising children. That's part of cultures unraveling, that they have lied and tricked women into thinking that motherhood is not the most beautiful, greatest responsibility job. You are literally like birthing the future of life. Like you are Mother Nature. Women control the evolutionary process of the human species. Like women control sexual reproduction. Men don't control that. Women control that. And so there is an incredible power in female sexuality. And we've talked about this throughout the week, is that like with great power comes great responsibility. So like women have figured it out, like, oh, wait a second, like I control the sex selection. So like, let me kind of step into this like dominant, more aggressive phase. And already women are super intimidating just in a normal setting. Like men are always going to be a bit afraid of approaching women. It's hard to talk to girls. There's a huge fear of rejection, no matter if you're the super boss guy, that's overcompensating with like bling and, supercars or whatever, or you're just like a normal dude. But the majority of the population are just normal average day working Joes. And so it is already just innately, women can be really scary. And so if you have a normal girl and then you hyperinflate her, now she's making more money. Now she's more educated. Now she's more confident in her abilities to not need a man. She doesn't want to have a family because society has convinced her that her career is more important than motherhood. Then it's even that much harder to feel like you can approach women and find a partner. And so I think you have a lot of men in society that have just given up, so whether or not it's like, you have this huge influx of the LGBTQ community that's kind of like, okay, we'll just stick with men because like, screw women. Or the other vast majority of men are just like, I'll just hide in my mom's basement and play video games because, I don't want to go have to slay a dragon. That's a lot of work. It is a lot of work to get a high value woman. And women cross-culturally, in Asia, Russia, Africa, the United States, it's very well studied. They marry across and up. So women tend to marry men that are older than them and make more money than them, are more successful than them, have higher social economic status. So if that's just an abject truth, a fact, cross-culturally, that means that as women are moving up that kind of value hierarchy of making more money, being more educated, all of these factors, then the percentage of men that are meeting their kind of evolutionary criteria is just getting smaller and smaller. And so that leads a small percentage of men that gets pushed into this kind of like keep a harem of 1 million girls because they have access to them. There's a small percentage of men that have access to a lot of women because a lot of women are mostly only interested in the top 1% of men.
So you could make a logical sort of inference that if the wealth gap, for example, right, is growing and the haves and have-nots, right, that gap is growing. And as you're saying, the gap between men who are ultra desirable, right, according to your framework, right, and men who are sort of a little bit less and a little bit less, all the way down, that gap presumably, right, would actually mirror what's happening in the economic world, right? In a sense, maybe it's fueling them. They're like mirrors of each other, right?
I think there's parallels or correlations at least.
So if it's true that we have like a widening gap between haves and have-nots, like economically, in pure dollar terms, we also have this like attraction power gap.
That's a great way of putting it.
Between men and women, which to me I have to say is a frightening thought in terms of the mental health implications that has, right? I mean, you could look at it a number of different ways, but I'm just thinking about it from like this like public health point of view, you know? And there, if we take that trend to be correct for the sake of argument, what we're looking at is a future where you have some feudal lords, right, who basically have, as you said, sort of like not just not just like 4 wives, but like a harem, right? Some type of
or just habitual dating.
Habitual dating, but it's not just habitual dating, because it is almost exclusive access, right? The key thing being is the exclusivity, because for those men to be dominant on that hierarchy, right? And you use that word hierarchy, they're not renting these women out, right? They are controlling their status by establishing exclusive rights. So again, because we want to talk about this in some type of like wellness point of view, I think, to me, the public health implications of that are just, they're so vast.
I also think social media is really fueling unrealistic expectations. And so you have this mass rise of social media, which has completely changed the whole fabric of dating and dating apps and how men and women interact with each other. And so you have all these influencers where there's so much highlight being shown that I think you have to be realistic with yourself of who are you compatible with on a number of different fronts. And so if you're a man who is constantly looking at hyper beautiful, hyper sexualized women online all of the time, and you're pleasuring yourself, or there's just this deep infatuation with 10 girl, and you're just constantly feeding yourself that, then when you get out into the real world and you're not what as society would deem, I'm not saying that you're any less or more, as a 10 guy, 6'5", multi-millionaire, super confident, chiseled jaw, hedge fund manager, you're not going to get a 10 girl. And so you're like constantly unsatisfied. And I think women, it seems like there's always going to be hierarchies in every single category of life, in every domain. There's going to be people at the top and there's going to be people at the bottom. And I think that's just that there's winners and losers, and you can play the game, and you can work your way up, you can build your character, and your character can decrease. And I think women are actually very smart, and they will allow men to compete amongst themselves, and then they kind of just pick the winners. Because again, whether or not they know it from an evolutionary perspective of passing on your genetic code and keeping the human species alive, there's a reason why the 2 top qualities that, again, cross-culturally women find in men, number 1 is height, or number 1 is confidence. And what is it really about height and confidence on a really deep level is it that's so attractive? And I think there's an element of safety, or men that are very financially successful. Is it just the money and what the money brings? Or is it something really deep within a woman that knows that, like, when I'm pregnant, I'm going to be vulnerable and my baby is going to be vulnerable? And is this man that I'm procreating with going to be able to, do I foresee him as being a provider and a protector? And, we don't really fight anymore. We're not out in the wild wrestling bears and going to wars. But there's still, that was a large, large part of human history where, like, if you were a big, strong man, you could probably protect your family more so than if you were a super small, scrawny, weak man. And so I don't think people necessarily think like this on a day-to-day basis, but I think it's primitive in our genetic makeup of women knowing that, like, this is the highest chance of success and fruition in my life. And as a man, it's really hard to grow yourself and to compete and go out to battle and to fight in the game. And so you have to have a lot of inner motivation to go out there and do that and be able to risk rejection and potentially lose battles. And so I think there's a lot of men who have just given up. and said like, well, I don't even want to, like, it's not even worth it.
I want to jump back to what you said, to what we were talking about regarding again, going back to this hierarchy quickly. We'll pick up on what you were talking about just there too. But the hierarchy that you described, right? It's hard for me to get this very dystopian image out of my mind, right? Because you also linked it back to social media, which I think, again, thank you for bringing that up, I think is absolutely, in fact, a major driver.
It's exasperating.
Major driver for mental distress. And that dystopian image that came into my mind is basically where you have a situation now where the digital realism continues to advance, right? Whether that is 6K, 8K images on a screen, you've got OLED screens everywhere, and on top of that, you've got robotics and other devices available to create immersive experiences that clearly could be used in some, context. It's not science fiction. We're right on that cusp where, you could imagine an OnlyFans top tier, top 10 account where you talked about one of these individuals who could potentially not just be attractive to 5 or 10 or some, even if it's a large number, some like manageable number in a offline context. But now you're talking about someone on OnlyFans who could essentially be the 10 broadcast digitally to not just 10 or 100, but to millions of people. And what's also really distressing, I think, too, and really like unsettling, is that there are a lot of young men, back to your point, now I'm jumping back to what you said about some men feeling like, sort of like, what are my odds? Like, what's the point? Because that resignation is really bad, right? And what I think is like quite distressing is that you see some young men who are just saying, well, actually, I'd almost prefer a digital partner. And you're seeing this, there's pockets of this in maybe Japan is a little bit ahead of the curve of this, where you have indoorsmen who are inward looking, hyper introverted, who are managing their biological and emotional needs through essentially purely digital means.
They're outsourcing.
Yeah. And I think that is, it's a recipe for a mental health disaster, in my opinion.
Well, it's definitely, I mean, you can, from a statistical point of view, you can see the results is that just the massive, I mean, you talk about Japan, which I think has a really extreme culture of cuddle cafes and all of these different, even if it's not sexual, I think a lot of people are just looking for intimacy. I think that's really where a lot of, I can just maybe speak for this from my personal perspective of that, like, there's men that think that they want sex, but deep down they actually just want intimacy and they want to be respected and they want to be valued and appreciated. And so it's actually a lot more innocent in a way of what a lot of men are really looking for. But if you haven't done things in your life to call respect upon yourself, then women are not going to respect you. And so there's an initial battle that has nothing to do with women that men have to tackle in themselves. Like, it's really hard to create a world-class physique. You have to work out for years before you look like a top 10 model, and diet and do all of these things and be really consistent. But once you do achieve it, it demands a lot of respect. And it demands respect because, in a way, you respect yourself. And so women can tell men that respect themselves. And I think somewhat of the danger is that there's a real blurred line between confidence and narcissism. And so I think you have some men that are borderline narcissistic, and maybe if a woman is not very mature and has not been educated properly by her parents, she is not able to tell the difference between a narcissistic man and a nurturing, caring, confident man, because a lot of the qualities are actually very similar, of just being, can go up and talk to any girl and I feel like I've got it. And, I'm just kind of like Rico Suave, and like, is that man really assured of himself and confident, or is he narcissistic and machiavellian and psychotic? And so a lot of times women don't know until it's too late that actually this man was not just competent and confident. He actually was malicious in the way that he presented himself to me. And because culture has completely washed away sex before marriage, or having value in purity, or saving yourself for your husband, that women think that they can earn a man's love and keep him by offering one of, or the greatest gift that she can give him, which is her purity and sexuality and her body, which is something that used to have to be really earned over a long period of time. She gives it to him, and then the man loses respect for her because it was just too easy. And then he leaves, and the woman is there confused as like, I gave you everything that you said you wanted. Why don't you still love me? And I think because of that, women have realized that over time that men do have a tendency of not being able to practice self-control and kind of get their lust under control. That kind of what I touched on earlier is they've just said, well, then I'll use you, or I'll take this into my power, or I want this. Like I am proud of my ability to be promiscuous and not be emotionally hurt by it. And so there's a detachment of what sex used to mean, having this like deep implication of like emotional soul bonding, as something that it's been kind of chucked up to like a handshake. Culture is telling people that sex doesn't have deep meaning and that you can use it just to fulfill your own personal desires. And that's just not the truth.
And wouldn't you say that that's, in a sense, a more balanced masculinity? I mean, it's a theme that we talked about before in terms of this having power creates the reciprocal level of responsibility, right? Because if you think about the hyper-masculine to me is extremely selfish, whereby it's really not about responsibility. It's heavily emphasizing the power part. So hyper masculine, the example that I would give would be the fetishization of firearms in some communities in the US, for example. To me, I think guns are necessary. I'm not sort of like hee-haw about guns, but I think you need a balanced view, and that in the context of the United States, if I lived there, I'd probably get a long rifle or something like that, right? I'm not a sort of like anti-gun person. Right. However, when I see people post images about, I've got 27 Zig Hours and arsenal. I've got this, and I've got 4 ARs, and I don't need any more 9s. I got plenty of those. It becomes this comic thing, which to me I think totally misses the point. It's now this fetish of collecting stuff, these little props that further my hyper-masculine identity. Whereas I think the balanced view, right? The balanced masculine view would be that, listen, I'll take care of a rifle, shotgun, do it. I know how to disassemble it. I know how to clean it. I know how to maintain it, store it properly. But I also understand the unbelievable destruction that this firearm can cause. And I also have a sense of all of the things that could go wrong with any lapse of my own responsibility.
This is, you brought up this in association with like America. And actually you asked the question right when we started that I kind of devoted off to, and you asked me like, what do you see the difference between like Asian masculinity and American Southeast United States? And I think like, in Hong Kong, we don't have guns, but like guys use their Rolex watches or their supercars or popping bottles at the club, so there's not guns in Hong Kong, but that overinflated male ego, showy peacock feather thing is like women in Asia are not interested or as attracted to heavily bearded boot men with, always has a 9mm strapped on and like a forklift truck. So the men, because it's a different culture, have adapted to what are the things in Asia that we are our version of like, always carrying around an AR-15. And that is normally flexing money, because money is very associated to status and power. And I think that it's piggybacking off of something that is evolutionarily necessary, of being a provider, being competent, showing consistency in your action, showing discipline, because it means generally that you had to work very hard, or like money doesn't come easily to everyone. There's a scarcity in resources that's distributed throughout the world. And so I think men in, from my experience in Hong Kong, they have their own versions of flashing guns, but they have just catered to the things that Hong Kong girls or Asian girls would find attractive in a very paralleled sense.
And it's easy to fetishize Rolex watches, right? I mean, I think in a way, it's the same thing as the guy who's got 27 SIG Sauers. It's the guy's not sitting there tinkering with the movement and, the hairspring, does it really go there? Is that a Neva Rocks? I think it's more about sort of expressing taste and also distinguishing oneself as somehow worthy.
Men also are not just, it's not solely fueled by women, which I think a lot of it is, but it's also heavily fueled by the fact, what I talked about hierarchy, is that men are competing amongst themselves. And so whether you're conscious of it or not, women are picking from the top down. If you had just any normal woman, if you could pick a very high value man versus, from a societal perspective, a lower value man, and you had the choice, you could say this one or this one. Obviously, you're always going to pick the one who's more good looking, taller, more successful, more athletic. And so these type of could be seen as superficial showmanship type things are also heavily influenced as, where do I place on the male dominance hierarchy? It's not just solely, I'm just thinking about women. Men are also thinking very much about other men. So there's definitely there's an element of just competitiveness that is very innate in men in any field, in sports, and people love competition. I mean, why do you watch sports? People love to see people trying to win. There's something about, and it goes back, the Roman Colosseum. What is it like? People have always loved to spectate on the fight, and there's champions that win and there's losers. And that's just the way it is. But we're not in the arena anymore as gladiators, or we're not necessarily fighting, or maybe you're not in sports. It really has to, your environment heavily dictates whatever that thing is for you in that culture. But men are also competitive amongst themselves. But I think there's a large percentage of men that have just completely said, I don't want to play the game.
Absolutely. And when you couple that with the trend lines that you talked about, where it seems like the dominant males, right, just because of the speed of technological change and the reach that digital platforms have in our lives, that some of these top dogs in that quote unquote dominance hierarchy will probably create an environment. They're just part of this environment where there's going to be a lot of men who, potentially give up, and giving up might have some different forms, sort of seclusion, isolation. And the flip side of that too would be some type of more worrying aspect of membership in some type of almost misogynistic, anti-women, quote unquote, incel type of culture.
It's good. The misogynistic, I think this ties into it, is that we've said this, it's like, hate the player, not the game. And I think some men are not winning, and so they see women as just hating the game. And so they're like, if I can't win on this, I'll take it by force, and I'll maybe be manipulative, or I'll use whatever resources I can to get what I want while I can get it, because I might not be able to get it again. And the digital world, where there is, we used to be very just community based, there was like a few pretty girls in the village and like a handful of guys, and you had to joust amongst the boys. Now you're competing with the whole world. It's like these girls, on Instagram, they can get a DM from a guy in Dubai and get flown out. And, it's like, how do I compete with the 1%? Sounds small, but that's still hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, I don't know how many millionaires there are in the world, but there's a lot of people who have $1 million. And the percentage is still small, but the actual number in and of itself is not small. Like, everyone is making more and more money. It's a very economy driven, like, people are starting businesses, people are investing, there's access to information. So there really actually used to be very few like kings that had like a harem of concubines. But now there's a lot of men who are very wealthy and very successful. And I do think the culture in a big city where the percentage of that is much, much higher, the competitive environment is not the same as if you're in a small town country. And so it can feel, when you're in the city, it can feel very overwhelming. And I think from a value perspective, if men are so concerned about beauty, you could actually be missing the necessary value and characteristic qualities of a woman. That beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, and society has hypersexualized women. And so I think a lot of men are looking for the wrong things. It's just, they just can't get past the fact that she's hot, but actually she would maybe not make a good mother or a good wife. And so there's been a big value shift of what is it about a woman that makes her beautiful. And for a long time, a really long time, beauty was purity. That was something that was so sacred. And there was a shame about, like, a lot of people used to get married out of wedlock. Oh no, we got pregnant, we got to get married. And it was just kind of like just a given that we got to get married, we're having a kid. That's just how it is, because society is like, there wasn't such a option of high abortion rates or high divorce rates. So there's a big cultural acceptance of what is now normal that fuels a lot of issues that we have today. There's a different general consensus about bad is good and good is bad.
Let's say that you're on the flip side of that equation and you are tempted to give up, and you're a young man, and somebody's close enough to you yourself in age, and they said, I'm lacking motivation, I'm overweight, I am watching too much pornography, I'm feeling adrift, I don't seem to have career growth. What would you say to that young man if you had a moment and they opened up to you and they asked for your advice?
I think people overcomplicate a lot of things. And when you look at problems, they seem so massive. And it can feel the complexity and grandness of the competition can feel overwhelming. So I think the simplest thing is making it very simple. What does your bedroom look like? That is your micro environment. Whether your bedroom is in your parents' basement or you have your own apartment, is your home in order? Do you make your bed in the morning? Do you clean your house? Because if your your immediate is disorganized and full of chaos, it's the root. It's going to reflect everything else in your life. So my advice would be stand up straight, pull your shoulders back, clean your room, go to the gym. It's, like make sure your health is the bedrock of everything in life. And when you get cancer or you get sick, you suddenly realize that everything that you were worried about becomes a second priority. And so I think it can be looked at as almost being very primitive, but I think the gym for men is an incredible place to build resilience, consistency, confidence. If you look at yourself in the mirror and you're not happy at what you see, then other people will look at you and not necessarily be happy at what they see. And so I think a lot of things really have to come from an internal place, and then the external will then recognize that. So I think first steps would be like clean your house, do some push-ups, and start to build some type of structure around your life. And I think from these really, really simple things, a lot of other things, it's kind of like the ripple effect. You start getting used to pushing yourself into uncomfortable situations. You start feeling more confident. You start feeling more assured about yourself. And so I think the gym is a really, really great place for a man who feels like he has nothing to start, because you might not be able to, advance your career in like an immediate way or make lots of money, but being well groomed, having good hygiene, just taking care of like your body is a foundational block that I think is really a great kickstart jumping point to elevate you in many other areas. And it will command respect from other people once you do get to even an intermediate level.
So maybe we can switch gears a little bit. I wanted to ask you a little bit about Hong Kong. I consider my hometown, and I have a lot of tremendous fondness for Hong Kong. So, it's 7 years you spent in Hong Kong now?
It will be eight in August.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So just tell me a little bit, because again, the southeastern United States, I can't think of more of a contrast, right? It's a contrast in so many different ways. The landscape is totally different. I mean, in some ways,
Well, I mean, geographically, I think maybe there might be some similarities, but I think the culture is definitely really vastly different.
The culture, the pace,
community attitude,
financial literacy, hustle mentality.
Mm-hmm. So just general differences overall. I think America as a whole has always been seen as a very like entrepreneurial spirit, big dreams, and go get 'em type attitude. So I do think there are some parallels as far as like a real desire to be better. But because Hong Kong is very saturated with finance bros, it does affect the culture of the majority of men that I meet in more upper echelons of society. It's just a given that the career that they work in is about money. That's the most common answer of like, what do you do? And just finance in some capacity. And there's obviously many, many different categories of what finance is, but people are going into their career with the intention of it's a money-driven career. Like I'm going to focus on a passion that has to do with money so I can make more money. And status and image in Hong Kong it's so imperative into the society, and people are very, very aware about how other people perceive them. One of the things that really attracted me about Hong Kong is that there is a really strong sense of national and cultural identity. So Hong Kong Cantonese is not really spoken anywhere else in the world. There are very, very few places in the world. So they have the uniqueness of kind of like having their own isolated language that in a way is kind of a dying language. As much as I love the fact they speak Cantonese, it's not like people all over the world aren't learning Cantonese. And Hong Kong has such a unique history, being a colony that was a Western colony of a massively influential, the British was just really powerful, and they influenced so many places in the world. They had so many different colonies all over the world, but then it has this Asian element to it. So there is more acceptance and more normalization of having foreign influence, while there still is a really strong identity of the local culture. I think people in Hong Kong see the community as being more important than the self, whereas in America, there is so much of an emphasis on individuality. So you are more important than anybody else. It's really all about you. And like, if it doesn't suit your best interest, then, it's like, well, sucks to suck. And Hong Kong.
And you like that?
No, I'm just saying that.
No. You like that about Hong Kong.
I like that about Hong Kong.
Right.
Yeah, because I think there's much more sensitivity to others. There's much more recognition and awareness about like, okay, I might want this, or this might benefit me, but then the next immediate thought that seems to follow is, but how is this going to affect everybody else? And there is some self-sacrificial elements about this might not be best for me, but this is best for us. And so I think as someone who, I really care about myself, and I will, I'll do what I need to do to make it to the top, but also I really appreciate practicing empathy and love and having a really strong community. I think it's this really beautiful balance in the culture where like everyone is really trying to make it to the top. Like, it's a hustle city. People work really hard. Everyone's trying to make money, but somehow at the same time, there is this really strong denominator of like, we are Hong Kongers, and like, we are in this together. And like, maybe it's a healthy competitiveness. It's like in sports teams, like the baseball players will all line up, or the, football players or soccer players, they'll all shake hands, and then they go and they play the game. And at the end of the game, they all go back and shake hands again. And so I think there's a feeling of like, it's like cutthroat and I'm out to get you, but like a respect for the winner, like they have a real respect for the game, even though there is this super competitive nature in these high earners, that they're like, yeah, like it's a recognition that it's hard to win, and a humility to know that if you lose, then hats off to whoever won. I like that it's like you can keep the competitiveness without losing the humanity.
That's really well put. There's something to be said about that, right? In terms of, I think there's a respect for the game.
There's a respect for the game.
There's a respect for the game, and that, funnily enough, there's a tender element to the cutthroatness, right? I think that's one of the endearing things about Hong Kong, that it's cutthroat, but it's not like the jungle. It's not like
New York City.
It's not like the praying mantis outside, like eating its prey. There's a social construct, and you see it in the holidays, right? I mean, you can tell a lot about a culture by what it decides collectively to celebrate, right? And Chinese New Year, which you got to celebrate alone in Australia.
No celebrations,
it's I don't know, it says a lot. It says a lot about the culture, right? I mean, that's what gets me a little bit about Christmas, modern Christmas, the commercialized Christmas, right? It's missing a little bit of the point, right? Where it's unbelievably materialistically driven. And again, that's its own sort of commentary there. But I think that the Chinese New Year is, it's a celebration of the agricultural origins of Chinese society, and the family basis of relations.
Like a common greeting in Chinese New Year is, I hope you get rich. Yeah. And so there's even like a sense of like, I wish you well, or red pocket, where there's a generosity in companies or amongst family. And I don't like red pocket, giving money to people that you work with. Christmas is very like, you look out for your immediate family, but you're not giving money out to just like your colleagues normally. I'm stereotyping a bit, but there is definitely of like, let's all get rich together, because we are a community and we are Hong Kong. And like, if you're rich and I'm rich and all of us are rich, like let's just all be rich together, and let's all like kind of go in this together. And I think tying into our conversation about family, and this is probably the first element that I really compliment and appreciate when I talk about Hong Kong to people from outside, is why I have such a fondness and a draw to it, is I think the West is really pushing the deterioration of the nuclear family. And I think Chinese culture has still really stayed true to respecting your elders, to respecting more conservative and more traditional values. Again, this is a generalization, but more of the women are still very much okay with being a wife. That's a good thing to be a wife, and even praised of being a housewife, because that means that your husband's making enough money that you don't need to get a job. And it's not frowned upon to be a mother. There's a lot of women that are still hold high value of motherhood. And I think that is reflective in a larger picture of the culture, is that you have respect for your elders. You have a really strong association to your parents, where, you have such a high percentage. And this is because of how expensive Hong Kong is and the rent and everything. But you have a lot of people that are still living at home. That does have its negative connotations to it, but you have a lot of adults that are still living at home until they get married. That's a lot more common to be in your early 20s or late 20s and to say like, I still really get along with my parents. And even if I don't get along with them, I'll push that to the side because that doesn't matter, because I need to respect them. And respect is way more important than whether or not you like them or not. You can respect people that you don't like. And so they're like, I have an obligation and a responsibility to show respect to the people who raised me and show respect to my ancestors and my lineage, that, I'll stay at home and save money until I find a wife, and then me and my wife move out and get our own place. And that is definitely more old school. Whereas in America, it's like, peace out, I'm 17, I don't like you, and I don't like you, and I don't want to live with you. And, even my mom was very clear, is like, when you turn 18, if you don't want to follow my rules, like, get out of the house. And, it was kind of like this 18-year-old cutoff idea in the United States of like, kind of like, you need to get out of the nest and fend for yourself. And I think that can kind of cultivate rebellion and like isolation between parents and children. And I have a lot of friends that even in today's culture, they're in their early 20s and they'll give money to their parents out of their paycheck. They'll give a percentage of money to their family. And that just blew my mind, because I was like, you're 23 years old. Like, you got to look out for yourself. Like, your parents are old and like they have a house. Like, why are you giving your money to them? They did their job. And it's like, well, it's a sense of responsibility of like, they invested all this money in me and they sent me to school. And so like, it's this cultural responsibility to give back. Whereas in America, it's like, if your parents are struggling, it's like, well, they should have figured it out on themselves, or like, that's their fault. I don't have a sense of responsibility. Like, I'm an adult now, I'm an individual. And I think that's a great quality of Hong Kong, is that there is a lot more emphasis on the family unit.
So how do people find balance with the frenetic pace? How do people, like, you see all these Pilates studios popping up, right? The gym culture is alive and strong. But what are the particular challenges that arise from the hustle mentality and the pace that you're talking about, the urban environment in Hong Kong?
Because I think the hustle mentality, it's very easy to focus on things that are superficial. And I think you don't actually need to be rich to be happy. And that's very much proven by the fact that statistically poor people don't really kill themselves. and all of the countries with the highest suicide rate are all the wealthiest nations in the world. And so, you could really, really dive into why that is, but that's very telling that your focus is so much on resources that it could be very easy to overlook the things that are actually necessary to live a fulfilled and happy life. And if you have food to eat and a roof over your head and a community and some personal goals and a person who loves you, that is a perfect recipe of living a beautiful, healthy, full life. And when the environment is so competitive, that I think it can really make you doubt yourself of feeling like what you have is enough, because everyone doesn't feel like they have enough. So you're like, well, maybe I should feel like I'm actually quite content with myself, but everyone seems to be super worried that they need more, or like they just have to get more. And so everyone is influenced by the people that are around them. And so even if you actually are someone who naturally falls into a place of being, I'm just really grateful for the things that I have. And I don't need a lot to be happy. If everyone around you does not feel that way, it's hard to keep true to that for a really long period of time. And again, it really ties into social media, is that social media generally is a highlight reel of all of the best moments of everyone's life. And so not even looking on a global scale, but just looking from a very micro perspective of the 600 or 500 or 1,000 people that you follow, everyone is always proclaiming and showcasing, not in the best moments of their life, but not just that, they are crafting images of what look like the best moments of their life. I know people that have posted stories at these amazing events with high-end food and influencers, like red carpet style. And then I talked to them and they were like, oh, last night was awful. Like I had no fun. I didn't talk to anybody. I was super bored. And I was like, your IG story looked so like, what? You look like you were having a blast. And it's like this feeling of a need to showcase to the world how well you're doing. And it is, a lot of people, it's really a facade. And that you have the most friends, that you get invited to the most activities, that you're eating the best food, just whatever it is that makes you appear to be doing really well, when deep down it's just like you're constantly chasing how to showcase where you're placed in the social ladder. Mm-hmm. And in Hong Kong, it is an urban jungle, and you do have nature. Of course, I think that's another a side piece of why I love Hong Kong, is because you have access to amazing beaches, you have access to amazing islands, you can go hiking, you have this like tropical jungle, warm weather paradise that's like right next to like New York City. And it's such a massive contrast that you have access to all these beautiful natural resources, but then you have access to all of the amazing benefits and social things that come with living in a big city. And that's why the rent is so high, because there is like the quality of life, if you can't afford it in Hong Kong, I think is the best in the world. If you can afford it, I mean, obviously there's personal taste of what your version of best is, but like, if you can figure out a high value skill to place yourself in the marketplace, you really have access to everything. And geographically, traveling to all these other countries are very cheap. And even the money that you make in Hong Kong, oftentimes, because everything is so high priced, when you travel, you spend way less money. Normally people travel and they spend more money on holiday. Most of the people in Hong Kong, when they travel, they spend less money because, it's like things are so expensive. I mean, that's not everybody, but I do, obviously you can go and live a high baller life in Switzerland or something. But like a lot of, the young crowd that's not, super, super established, you can be in your early 20s. I didn't know that people in the early 20s took multiple international trips a year working like a normal job. There is an option and a strong possibility that you can live like very high class lifestyle in Hong Kong that you wouldn't necessarily be able to live in the United States. I know people that work at boutique shops that go to Korea 5 times a year. it's like, what? Like if you were in America and you worked a normal job, like you maybe like take a few trips around your state, but you're not taking international flights every 2 months. And it's just, I think that I have gotten to see the world while basing myself, like having Hong Kong as a home base, I've gotten to see the world from that like launch platform. And I think it's why it's such a deterrent of why would I want to move back to the United States? Like I get to go from Tennessee to Georgia versus Tennessee to like Phuket. I mean, from Hong Kong to Phuket or Tennessee to Georgia, it's like, maybe I've never lived in Europe, but I think there could be maybe like in Europe, you can take a train to other countries that speak other languages and like has different cultures. I've not spent a tremendous amount of time in Europe, but I can imagine that there's also that feeling and that attraction to Europeans that you really do have access very quickly to be in other cultures and other environments and other food and other languages cheap, and it's very accessible. And so I think that's also a really big benefit of Hong Kong. It's right next to China. China's way cheaper. You have all this incredible infrastructure. The city has basically no crime. It's super safe. You can be a woman dressed in a miniskirt at 3 a.m. stumbling down the street, and like you're not really gonna have to worry about anything bad happening to you. The violent crime's almost non-existent. The infrastructure is incredible. The trains are never late. Everything is really clean. There's no litter. There's no visible drug addiction anywhere in the normal societal population. You don't see homeless people. It's just a really great quality of life. And if you are a local, you can live rather cheaply. Or as a foreigner, if you figure out how to live like a local, you can go to the fresh markets. You can buy your fruits and vegetables at the stalls. You can buy your meats at the wet market. Yeah. And the life expectancy in Hong Kong is longer than any other place in the world, both for men and women. And so that really says something. People in Hong Kong are living longer than any other country in the world. And Hong Kong has the highest red meat consumption in the world. So like you have these carnivore diet people that's like, look at Hong Kong, they eat more red meat than everyone and they're living longer. So you could chuck it up to diet. I think diet has a huge part of it. It's very common in Hong Kong to buy your food every day fresh. On the way home from work, people like buy their groceries that day, cook them that day. Whereas in America, I remember having 16 grocery bags on each arm, as I like trucked from we make a grocery trip like once a week or twice a week, and you like stockpile. But at the same time, like why is the food lasting for 2 weeks? Versus in Hong Kong, you buy it every day, maybe because it's like not ultra processed. The grocery stores in Hong Kong, you don't have access to processed food like you do in America. There's just not space. There's like, you go to the cereal aisle, there's like 3 types of cereal. It's like whole wheat corn, whole wheat bran, and then like you maybe get like whole wheat corn with a little bit of sugar on it. But you don't, when I went back to the US after not having been there for 3 years, and I saw the cereal, there was an aisle.
Just for cereal.
Or an aisle just for ice cream. I think Hong Kong people just live a more healthy lifestyle. And I've read many, many studies about this, that walking a certain amount of steps a day increases the longevity of your life. It is so well studied. It's an absolute fact that people who walk every day live longer. And, I don't know, I can't regurgitate all of the exact scientific details as to why that is, but walking is one of the most healthy things that you can do and the most simple things that you can do to increase your life expectancy. And people in Hong Kong walk everywhere all the time. Most people don't have cars. Walk to the subway, you walk. Everyone walks all day. And so
short car trips, if you do take a car, you take a taxi or...
Yeah, short. But a large part of the population walks. These are all great qualities that I see about the city.
And if you take the subway, you're, even
still
if you're
mobile.
on the escalator, there's going to be a few steps here or there. You're changing levels. The topography too is hilly in pockets. Walking around in LKF area, you'll get a bit of a burn if you're headed up
that hill.
Yeah.
I just think in America you can choose to never walk anywhere, and I think in Hong Kong, like, you can not walk anywhere, but I think a large percentage of the population is not getting chauffeured to each of their destinations. There's obviously a group of people that always take taxis and Ubers and have, drivers and stuff like that. But like, I believe that the majority of the population are taking public transit and walking everywhere, walking to the subway, walking home. Whereas a car, you drive, then you walk 3 steps, and then you sit at your desk, and then you drive, and you walk 3 steps, and you sit on your couch. There's just less active activity.
Exactly. And there's probably nothing simpler than passive exercise.
And it's incredibly beneficial.
Where you're not even thinking about it. It becomes part of your routine.
Oh, the elderly people in Hong Kong. I remember when I first moved, I was living in Yulong, and I was like, you get up at 6 a.m. and there's like 30 aunties in the morning at the daybreak of dawn doing arm swings and hand clapping and like just out and about. Like the elderly population in Hong Kong seems like quite poppin'. You have old people just out doing exercises. I think in America, you just don't have, I don't know, there's maybe just not as strong of an emphasis. But it's hard to say America, because America is really, really, really big.
There's also some, like, you talked about like the simple guidance, the simple advice that you would give to the 16-year-old who's watching too much porn, overweight, and so on. I think the simple answer to that is also that if you're taking public transport as opposed to sitting in your own vehicle, there's a physical cubic limit to how fat you can get. And again, as someone who's, I've been as heavy as like, I'm 105 kilos now, but I've been as heavy as like probably almost 135, 140, right? And I remember, that was when I was in the States, surprise, right? Surprise, big surprise.
Food, the diet.
Right? But the sedentary lifestyle, and I find it's also that when you can retreat back to your own vehicle, right? The size of which just seems to continually improve, not to increase, and not necessarily because people need a bigger engine or they need a bigger screen for this or anything. I think it's also because the cubic volume, the people are getting bigger, and thus the cars required to move bigger people also need to get bigger. But in Hong Kong, you cannot physically get around if you're too big.
It's also more societal pressure. So the first thing when I landed in JFK after not visiting America for 3 years, I was just absolutely floored by how many overweight people there were. And again, even way back when we first started talking about like your environment affects you a lot. If you're really overweight in Hong Kong, you're going to feel a lot of just, even if people aren't judging you, you're going to feel judgment by what the environment presents itself around you. And there's just not a lot of people who are obese. And so you're going to feel much more like an anomaly in Hong Kong, being super, super unhealthy and overweight than you would in the United States, which gives you like more permission because it's more popular, more accepted.
I think that's a good point. I think that one of the big things, the big differences when it comes to this topic is that in Hong Kong and, let's face it, most of the world outside the United States, people eat with family. Whereas in the United States, so much food is consumed alone.
Drive-through culture.
And it's oftentimes, I think it's not even just the food itself. It's the social setting too, when it's consumed. If we're having a conversation, we're engaged, and we're sharing a meal like our ancestors did. We're firing on all these cylinders. Our metabolism is like just primed, right? We're generating saliva, which is like the first enzyme that your body uses to break down the food, right? The amylase. And we're engaged. That's what it's about, right? Humans should be sharing meals. And that to me, I think that's a really alarming thing that I see, as you said, with the fast food culture, because fast food, it's designed to be effectively like inhaled. And it's shocking. It's shocking how fast you can eat. Like even a Big Mac, it looks pretty sizable, but it's tasty, it's easy to hold, it comes at a cool temperature, there's no bones, it's like frictionless. Whereas if you think about the Chinese preparation, I think that something as simple as the fact that the meat comes with bones, right? These type of things that are speed bumps to getting fat. Because when you sit there, you actually are like, okay, that's a piece of chicken. And I don't think there's one Westerner who visits Hong Kong and doesn't comment about how Chinese people eat chicken.
Or the fact that there's still the head of the chicken on the table. There's a more, how do I say this, like acceptance of the animal. It's like in America, it is so taboo to go to a butcher and see the animal hanging. Like when I lived in Sam Sui Po, and you see the entire pig hanging in the window. And like there's almost a disconnect from the animal to the stomach in the United States, where we're like, we don't want to see that chicken has a head. It's a chicken. You know you're eating chicken, but you like need it presented in a way that almost detaches you from something.
But do you know it's a chicken? It's been deboned, it's been battered and probably double fried. And by the way, in English, we don't even call it the animal name. Beef is not cow meat. Pork is not pig meat, right? We create these other names, so there's even further distance, right? Whereas in Chinese language, pork is 猪肉. So I think that's a really incisive point about how this food, it's no surprise, it comes from an animal origin. That animal lived a life there. It has identifiable body parts, right? There's viscera there, right? I mean, you've gone through the wet market, right? And as you said, you see it there, and it's
Raw.
It's there. It was living not too long ago, right? And when you batter things and you debone them and you put excess seasoning and you require sauce and so on and so forth to make it palatable, every once in a while I think you have to ask yourself a question. I mean, it's like, is that the healthiest thing that you could be eating? My wife and I, one of our shows that we would share, as a couple, Real Housewives, one of the lines in one of the episodes was, "Oh no, I can't eat this such and such ethnic food. It's too fresh."
Wow.
It's too fresh. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. Because I come from the milieu where fresh is unambiguously good. Fresh is tastier, it's more nutritious, it's more vibrant. The colors, right? Like my childhood going to the wet market and so on, you'd look at the eye of the fish. You might actually have one in the tank right there that they would take out, kill, prepare right there in front of you. So I think that's a great point too about that proximity to the food source. Switching gears again a little bit, tell us a little bit about your first contact in Australia and to Queensland. It's been a pretty great week, and it's been a real pleasure having you
Thank you for having me
here in North Queensland.
Well, first impression was a lot of people are barefoot. Even outside in the shopping mall, there does seem to be, but almost maybe there's a deeper meaning behind the barefootness of groundedness, or why is the earth seen as so dirty? Like, what is it about us that needs to have some 3-inch rubber between me and the dirt? I've been living in a major metropolitan city now for 10 years between New York and Hong Kong. But I come from grassroots. My uncle owned a butcher shop. My grandfather was a craftsman, a woods worker. A lot of my aunt and my grandmother, their family built their own homes that they lived in for long periods of time, that they cleared from trees, that they cleared the lot of land. And a lot of my family hunted, and we had a large freezer dedicated to meats that we ate throughout the year. And so that was something, the association to Hong Kong actually is that, like, you know, my family hunted, and actually seeing the live animals was not so shocking to me because I was like, oh yeah, like, you know, this is, you're eating an animal, you know, and that is quite normal. But your question about Australia, it's hard for me to really comment on Australia, because I think the most impactful thing that I'll walk away is the relationships that I built here. And so I think another reason why I have such a deep connection and a deep love for Hong Kong is, yes, the geographical landscape, yes, you know, all these external great qualities, but Hong Kong would not be Hong Kong if it were not for my relationships and the tremendous amount of people that I've been able to connect with. My home in Hong Kong, I've done some rough estimates based off of a lot of video and photo evidence, because I really document a lot of things in my life on my phone. I've lived in Central for 4 years, and I know for a fact that over 400 different people have been to my house. I know and 400 is a conservative number. So that's incredible to me. Over hundreds of people have been to my home in Hong Kong in the last 4 years. That's not, I mean, I didn't do events with my other houses, but I am fully immersed and connected to the community in Hong Kong. And I have people that know me in many areas that I go to, both on the nightlife front, on the artistic front, and in the dance sector. And so that's a reason that I have such strong emotional feelings. And so I think walking away from Australia, it's, yes, this property is absolutely stunning. You know, you have just such lush greenery. The air is very fresh. There's no pollution. But it was just the quality of people and your crowd curation that is by far going to be the most impactful thing, because the earth is alive, plants are alive, the animals around us are alive, but there was such a deep human connection that I encountered here, and so much vulnerability, so much openness, humility, curiosity from the people that I met here. And, you know, I was up the last 5 nights. I've been up to 4:30 in the morning. All of us were sober, talking. You know, we didn't have a tremendous amount. This wasn't while as an amazing host, you definitely made a conscious effort to provide activities for us and excursions and town visits, I would still say that they were all quite simple in nature. You know, we weren't going to some great 7 wonders of the world. You know, we went to the local kind of rinky-dink town and looked at the tiles on the walls of buildings and read plaques about different history, about what the details of things were, and just really were able to find pleasure in not being overindulged. And I think society now is so desensitized. People's attention span is so short because of social media is very short form content. TikTok, Instagram Reels, you know, the average view of a reel is like about 8 to 15 seconds. You know, in media now, even with Hollywood films or mainstream movies, the amount of cuts that they make in a scene is like tenfold what it was when movies first came out. You know, you'd have just one really long shot of something.
French Connection.
Yeah, of like 8 minutes of just one film. And now all movies, just to be able to keep people's attention, cut, different angles, different scene of just 2 people talking. You know, and this, if they were filming it, you know, it'd be top down, up down, side to side, you know, different angles and speed and slow-mo. And so there was no feeling of lack in my trip here. And everyone seemed to be, we had, every meal was shared together. Different people were cooking. The food preparation started earlier on the day with the smoked brisket. So there was a intentionality hours and hours before we ate about planning what the food was going to be, preparation of the food, coming together, and a sense of community of, for me, we're all total strangers, including you. Very much no existing like deep relationship. It was really like throwing a bunch of strangers in a house together for me and just kind of like hoping for the best, you know? And like, you know, people make TV shows about that. They literally are like, okay, we're going to all these people, we're going to chuck them in the house, and we're going to throw cameras on each of the corners and just like watch everybody fight, you know? And like, obviously there's like, it's pushed to have some drama, but there was no drama. We got deep into religion. We got deep into philosophy. We got deep into trauma, personal, deep vulnerability trauma of relationships and love affairs and goals and making money and how to manage your money and what to do with your life and all of these, like, you know, I mentioned this before, like I have conversations with some people with sometimes over dinner and they'll go, wow, that was really deep. And nobody once in the midst of conversation was like shocked that we were talking about quote unquote deep topics. It just seemed like just topics. And I felt like I had almost no superficial conversations in the last 2 weeks. I don't feel like I ever was idle chit-chatting to kind of get through some social BS thing to kind of make, you know, it just seemed like everybody spoke their mind. I think the best word to summarize it really would just be raw. It just felt very raw. And obviously you have built up these beautiful properties. So we're not like, it's not like camping in a tent, you know, we're still in these like beautiful houses. The bedrooms are really nice. There's a sense of luxury about the property, which is the icing on the cake, that you were somehow able to combine a feeling of luxury while holding true to simplicity and just authenticness. And I think sometimes when you operate in things that are expensive or this luxury mindset, that it tends to really be far away from anything raw, whether it's like the outfits you're wearing in an event or the food is presented with flowers and smoke things. And like, you know, oftentimes luxury is really associated with almost superficialness sometimes. And so I felt like it was a perfect harmony of comfort and groundedness. But definitely what I walked away from was feeling really connected to a new group of people.
Well, for a performer in a performance art that is essentially silent, I commend you for an exceptional verbal ability. Truly. And I think I want to give you the last word on that. The only thing I wanted to wrap is saying, thank you for your company. Thank you for your spirit. Thank you for sharing what was a fantastic week and what was really like a prototype for the simple wellness retreats that we're trying to create here. So on that, thank you. And you must come back.
Yes, I'll be back.
Really? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you.